some of the challenges faced by people on the move in violent contexts, we should start by challenging this binary notion of forced and voluntary migration. There is a world of complexity in the motivations that lead to the decision to migrate. However, public policy usually relies on the myth of these clearly distinguishable categories. But of course, reality often surpasses that taxonomy. So the majority of categories are permeable. The motives and the self-categorizations may change the course of a migration trajectory depending on the migrant's opportunities for successful admission and integration into the country of destination. I like to think of migration, that migration occurs actually along a continuum. At one end, with individuals and collectivities that are more proactive, using the rational choice decision-making in the decision not to migrate, or more reactive decisions that are based in panic, in fear, in the flee or persecution, etc.
So the kind of challenges that people on the move face during violent conflicts vary across time and spaces. Primarily, there is a breakdown of security, social security networks are breaking down. There is a lack of access to basic amenities such as shelter, such as food. There's no access to hospitals, to education as well. And so throughout the migratory processes during or post-conflict, there are a variety of situations, a variety of resources that people do not have access to. And because of that, they're struggling as well. Apart from just the conflict itself.
Forced migration is not only a consequence of violence, but actually an act of violence in itself. And this is a dimension that we need to further explore as scholars as well as practitioners.
A lot of times when people are migrating during a conflict or after a conflict, they are forced to live in refugee camps, for example, Syrian refugees. And for a long time, when they're in the camps, it's not a proper shelter situation. So women in particular face a lot of problems in their access to, for example, sanitary products. And that is a big issue, especially for women. So there's the intersection of gender with migration that comes with, during armed conflicts, that is really stark.
My research focuses on the collective memories of two communities that migrated to France when Algeria gained its independence in 1962. The first group, the Harkis, were Algerians who had supported the French for a wide variety of reasons during the War of Independence from 1954 to 1962. After the war, they were considered traitors and subject to reprisal violence by the victorious Algerian independence fighters. The second group, the Pieds Noirs, were settlers of European origin who returned to France, although many were originally from Italy, Spain, and Malta and had never actually experienced life in metropolitan France. It seems as though in cases of forced migration during times of conflict, like that experienced by the Harkis and the Pieds Noirs, these groups and their experiences reveal heightened versions of many of the same challenges that all migrants can face. The need to secure housing, food, and work, and then to create community, a sense of belonging, and a purpose in the new environment. So they do so with a background of insecurity and danger that makes meeting these needs all the more urgent. When using gender as a category of analysis, we can see that not only are women often the most vulnerable in this process, they can also be the most resilient. So we hear stories of women who lost their husbands, who became widows, while their husbands hadn't officially been part of the French army, and so therefore they weren't eligible for a pension, which put these women in a really precarious financial situation. We even hear stories of women giving birth in the internment camps, including during the winter months, and the winter of 1962 was one of the coldest on record. So this was a really difficult situation in which the women were often responsible for ensuring the survival of their families. At the same time, we see that women were often really resilient. It's actually the daughters of the Harkis who challenged and ultimately broke the institutional silence around the history of the Harkis, the shameful stigma that had been held against them for a whole generation. And it was really the women, the daughters, speaking up, telling their father's stories that ended the silence and really kind of rehabilitated the image of the Aki.
Men, women, and non-binary individuals, as well as trans people, children, elderly, etc., show differences in their migration behavior, face different challenges and opportunities along the migration journey, and have to cope with different risks as well, such as vulnerability of their rights, abuses, exploitation, discrimination, and specific health risks associated to each characteristic. Therefore, it is becoming increasingly obvious that migration is not, therefore, a gender-neutral phenomenon as it was thought 30, 40 years ago. Here is where the concept of intersectionality plays an enormous or huge role.
I think currently in understanding gender, we have to understand this concept holistically and use the lens of intersectionality here as well. So when we talk about women and their experiences during armed conflicts, we have to look at how, in what ways, in the different ways that they suffer or they struggle. So for example, they face sexual exploitation. And this is also across time and space, so it's not at a particular time during the conflict or post-conflict. It can happen across their travel transition time at any point during transit or at the point of destination or in the country of their origin as well when they're starting that journey.
Since there is a strategic use of rape in our conflicts to demoralize the enemy, as well as a reward for troops, or is the result of a breakdown in social constraints upset during war. SGBB, from a psychological point of view, is also the consequence of course, toxic form of masculinity and or the expression of frustration, aggression, and made trauma, classic phenomenon that are present in wars and violent conflicts. The persons affected by SGBB in migration contexts are overwhelmingly women and children, and boys and girls. Although we've seen an increase in violence and visibility of violence against LGBTQI plus individuals, and in proportion men that also account for cases of SGBB in context of migration. In addition, domestic and gender-based violence are not considered a cause for or a source of persecution by the 1951 Geneva Convention. Therefore, individuals who experience SGBB in the context of violent conflict or during the migration process cannot appeal to the authorities for refugee-based status based on this condition. However, there are also several countries nowadays that include legal instruments at national and regional levels to incorporate SGBB as a legitimate reason for asking for protection.
Working on the interface of gender and migration, I believe that one of the things to do is to move more towards qualitative and participatory approaches so we can highlight and uplift the voices of women even more in this realm of gender and migration. And we can hear their stories and hear their needs from them, because a lot of times what happens is that we essentialize women into either being victims or being the solutions for any problem. So even if the problem is sexual and gender-based, we put the solution to them. So they have this added burden of taking care of the problem that they face as well. So it's this either or binary situation, which I think if we go for a more qualitative route, if we uplift their stories, if we hear their stories and bring them out even more, we would be able to have a more complex understanding of what women's needs are, what do they want in any particular context. Along with that, I think there's a need to problematize the category of gender even more. There is a lot of times a tendency to equate, to synonymize gender with women. And even when we say women, we are often referring to cisgendered heterosexual women. So there's a need to problematize that further and focus also on queer communities and their needs, focus on trans women, on lesbian women, gay women, bisexual women, and not just homogenize or look at this category in a homogenizing manner, because that also does not benefit the people who are marginalized on the basis of their sexual and gender identities.
So in studying the Harkis and the Pieds Noirs and their collective memories, it's really apparent how the memory of war has been gendered male and has failed to take into consideration, for the most part, the experiences of women and war. So it's especially apparent in the 20th century, where the line is really blurred in terms of where the war took place and who experienced the consequences of the war, and that women had their own particular perspective and experience that really needs to be included in wartime narratives, migration history, and commemoration of conflict. Because when we neglect this point of view, we don't have the full perspective of the consequences, the repercussions of conflict, and that also has an impact on how we consider current conflicts and sort of the most vulnerable populations who are experiencing them.